In April when they open the hearings or the
Good afternoon.
public telling.
My name is Carolin Emcke. Let me welcome you here in the Globe Theater of die Schaubühne in Berlin. Thanks very, very much for coming despite the circumstances, and a warm welcome to everybody who's watching the stream wherever you are. I'm really excited to have this second panel on demagogy and normalization of our transatlantic conversations on neo-fascism. As you may know, or you may have read, this is a cooperation between the New York Review of Books and the Schaubühne, and most of all, it's not most of all, but also it's a cooperation of Daniel Mendelsohn and I. Daniel asked me a while ago if we could think together, if we could bring in a group of artists, scientists, intellectuals on both sides of the Atlantic to discuss the questions that really, I would say, haunt us. So here's Daniel in New York. I welcome you, and maybe you can introduce the guests on your side of the ocean, and then I'll introduce my guest here in the theater.
Yeah, thank you, Carolin, and welcome everybody. We're very excited to continue the conversation that we began a couple of hours ago under the heading of a general conversation about what we, I think, all recognize as a significant increase in the past decade and a half in right-wing neo-fascistic tendencies in governments around the world, and that current was what first inspired me to reach out to Carolin, whom I know from different activities over the years, and to see if there were a way to have a transatlantic conversation, and one of about this phenomenon, because it seems already, just after the first panel, that there are important distinctions between these currents in Europe and the United States, both as they are evinced in actual electoral politics, but also in the reactions of American versus European intellectuals about the legacy of fascism, when it's all right to talk about fascism, when it's all right to use the word fascism. Many interesting themes came out of the first panel, which strove to understand in what context it's all right to talk about these currents as fascism. What is the vocabulary we need to use? What are the dangers of invoking a past which is very specific, and yet what are equally the dangers of being afraid to make historical parallels? And what we're now going to turn our attention to, with the help of our distinguished panelists, is to my mind, and I raised this question in our first panel, the constitutive, the soil out of which these movements spring. And specifically, as we know, one particular current, which is demagogy and the rise of authoritarian leaders, strongmen, the rhetoric they use, the aesthetics of demagogic authoritarian figures, and the concomitant phenomenon, which I think has been very alarming on both sides of the Atlantic, which is normalization of what once had been, to use Masha Gessen's term, unthinkable in democratic politics. And so that is our focus for the next hour and a half. I'm, on behalf of the New York Review of Books and the American side of this transatlantic conversation, I'm very happy to welcome both Fintan O'Toole and Bonnie Honig. Fintan O'Toole is a columnist for the Irish Times. He's a professor of Irish letters at Princeton University. He has a new book coming out, We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Modern Ireland, which I think, Fintan, is just coming out this month, as I understand. He's written extensively for the New York Review of Books over the years on both literature and politics, with very trenchant pieces, I'm happy to say, about Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, the influence of right-wing Catholicism increasingly in American politics. So we're very happy to have Fintan O'Toole. Bonnie Honig is a professor of modern culture and media and political science at Brown University. her many books include Political Theory and the Displacement of Politics, Democracy and the Foreigner, Emergency Politics, Paradox Law, Democracy, and Public Things, Democracy and Disrepair. And so I think just the titles of those books will suggest to you why she'll be a vital part of this conversation.
Thanks, Daniel. May I add, even though I assume this is not done so often, Bonnie Honig actually happens to be also my former professor. I cannot convey how much I learned from her. So I'm terribly honored and very, very happy that she's here. And let me also introduce my guest here in Berlin, who is Josef Vogel. He's a professor for literature and cultural science at the Humboldt University in Berlin. He's done extensive research into the theoretical and cultural structure of capitalism and platform economies. Many here will know his many books. The last one, which actually I think was published in March 2021, is called Capital and Resentment. I'm very, very happy to have you here. If I could start with, just to jump into this discussion, and taking up something that Masha Gessen said in the previous panel when they spoke about the unimaginable. A different way to frame it was there were certain shocks that set in. When I think we suddenly thought something unimaginable that we thought was unimaginable is happening. And I'm curious to ask all of you, when did that kind of shock set in for you? With Brexit? With the election of Donald Trump? Or would you even say it was much prior to that? Maybe we start with Fintan.
Hi, everybody. It's a great privilege to be with you. I think certainly for me, there was a sense that this was coming. And particularly, I think, in the European context, but also in the American context, I think, it really the aftermath of the great crash of 2008, that crisis of capitalism, and I think it was beginning to be clear that the failure of a kind of coherent democratic response to that crisis was disastrously feeding reactionary demagoguery, which had real roots. It had roots in a profound sense of betrayal. The anti-elitist rhetoric, really, which is where so much of this takes off, had pretty substantial foundations in perceived and experienced reality for so many people. The idea that was suddenly revealed to most people, which was that banks, for example, were in fact public institutions, and that while the profits had been privatized, the debts were nationalized, and belonged to all of us. That was very profoundly shocking, and then the introduction of austerity policies, less so in the United States than in Europe. But throughout Europe, certainly, the almost religious idea, so it was cloaked as rational economics, but it was very much a religious idea of punishment, guilt and sin, which had to be atoned for, purgation, that particularly the bad economies, Greece, Ireland, my own country was part of, and remember this phrase was being used, which was PIGS, P-I-I-G-S, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, and Greece, the bad countries who had to be punished for their sins,
Mm.
with of course no concomitant idea that there was bad lending as well as bad borrowing. These realities, I think, were experienced by people in very dramatic ways and in very immediate ways. So these were hardships that were experienced, but also a deep sense of injustice, a deep sense that nobody told us that we were going to be responsible for all of this private debt, and suddenly it was being heaped on public exchequers, and having that playing out then in terms of people's lives, in terms of their wages, in terms of their social welfare entitlements, all of that kind of thing. I think that disastrous response really created the conditions in which these other forces really could, which were already, of course, pre-existing. These movements were largely present, but it allowed them really to gain a kind of momentum, which, so I would see Trump and Brexit and Orban and all of that as outcomes of things that were very much underway from 2008 onwards.
Bonnie?
Thank you. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Excuse me. So you asked the question initially in a personal way, which is when did the shock hit us? And so I'll answer in that way initially, which is I do recall sitting and watching the election results in 2016 and being entirely both surprised and shocked to hear that Trump was declared the winner of the election. And I'm not sure we've quite recovered even from that sense of it. In that evening, it had a lot of repercussions. And we did things like other people describe about getting passports ready and the rest, in the expectation that things could get bad very fast. But things get bad in this country fast for some people and slow for others. So what I think happened over the next few years, and I would like to contextualize that 2016 in an earlier era as well, but just confining myself to that for the moment. What happened in the next few years were a series of impossibilities, each one sort of absorbable, and under all those absorptions underwritten by this somewhat faith, not an unshaken faith, that the institutions would somehow survive. There was a great investment in the US in the Mueller report, in Mueller and the Mueller report. And when that was handled in such a way as to neutralize its impact and to disguise some of its findings and to never release it fully and publicly, that was another shock. And especially the way that it was done, the Mueller report, which did find wrongdoing done by Trump, but released it drip, 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 drip over a period of days. And then, so it never was allowed to have a kind of impact. So that all of those things were kind of shocking in their own way. But thinking about these issues, I am also struck by how those of us who live relatively insulated lives in the US have been shocked by the appearance of violence in the streets, by the appearance of militarization among various forces, federal and state level. And at the same time, I hope most of us have become increasingly aware that we have been living side by side with people who experience these forces and powers and violences in a more immediate and less insulated context. So I'm thinking now of a young man named Amir Locke, who was just shot a day or two ago in Minneapolis by police who were issued a no-knock warrant, which means they could just barge into your house in the middle of the night without knocking on the door and look around for whomever they want to arrest. And, people are murdered every year by the police because of no-knock warrants. And in Minneapolis, a commitment was made to outlaw no-knock warrants, but apparently they go on, and now someone else is dead. So I wanted to mention his name and also that of Breonna Taylor, who was killed in a no-knock warrant situation in Louisville, Kentucky, a couple of years ago, because I wrote a book about shock, and I have sort of thought a lot about it, and we'll talk more about it maybe later in this panel, but one of the things that I've made a commitment to is pointing out its uneven and asymmetrical distribution in our society, and how some of us are living with different kinds of shocks and every day, and others of us have something of a privilege at feeling quite shocked when what's normal, which we kind of liked, has gone awry in some way. Mm-hmm. So just to register that, Breonna Taylor was also, as I say, murdered. She's from Louisville, Kentucky. She was murdered by police and in a no-knock warrant situation. So that's just one set of things. I don't know if I want to say very much more. I guess the only other thing I would say is that, you know, all of us, someone said to me recently that historians have done very well during this period because we're all looking for precedents. And especially in the US, you know, there's an opportunity to re-educate people about Reconstruction, about, you know, the Depression era and the building up of government to respond to people's needs, and the Civil Rights era, and how those of us who came up in the shadow of the Civil Rights era and the great victories were in a position to assume a certain kind of progress and then to be shocked at the reaction against it that started to really take place under the Reagan presidency. But if you look at the century in a more historical way, over the whole of the century, that period in the 60s could be just an anomaly, and we could have returned to form. Now, which one that is will partly depend on what we all do. So I think the most important thing is to figure out not only what should be shocking, but how to address shock in such a way that we can be reactivated into citizenship rather than forced onto the sidelines. Mm-hmm. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Joseph, also the same question to you. I mean, when did you have a sense of there's something unprecedented, there's something unimaginable? When did the shock set in?
So, good to see you this evening, Carolin. And perhaps I may answer in two steps. First step, I would say that I feel a certain distrust against the short-term perception and against events which are sudden, explosive, and very loud. And I think if you have perspective on the long way of production of the present disaster, and the question when this or these little funny monsters like Trump and like Johnson, etc., were produced, we have to go back to at least to the 80s, to the liberalization of markets, to neoliberalism, to Thatcher and Reagan. And I think this long history, or longue durée, is important to understand what happens in the moment. First step. Second answer, I think, and I completely agree to what Fintan said, that 2007 and 2008 was in a certain way a shock, because we had, in the shadow of this crisis, we had very interesting dynamics of right-wing politics and right-wing movements. So it began with a financial crash. By the way, it's very interesting that every big financial crash since the end of the 19th century was followed by right-wing movements, anti-Semitic movements, and xenophobic movements, just to remember. First step, it was the start of the Tea Party in the United States. Then came Obama, 2008, and with Obama, American racism came out of its latency, became manifest. And the first, I think, dramatic summit of this movement was the struggle or the fight of Obamacare, 2010. In 2010, I was in the United States. I had the impression that this was a sort of civil war constellation. And I think Obama, especially a black president, was a sort of catalyst for racism in the United States. And then came Trump, but Trump was not a new event. Trump was a sort of, what to say, it was a hole in which all the toxic liquids of right-wing American politics found its base.
Daniel?
Well, I'm very happy to hear what Joseph was just saying, because I personally think it's very important to look back to the 1980 election in some sense as a major turning point or a watershed toward the current moment. You know, Reagan's election, which I'm still haven't gotten over, is you know, the beginning of a current of which Trump is the end result, it seems to me. For many reasons, but one of them, with respect to our specific focus today of demagogy and normalization, is the open contempt for government and its institutions, the promulgation of the idea that people within government were evil, that only outsiders could do the right thing in government. You know, all that was the thing that lifted Reagan up. And I think that Trump is a sort of a logical reductio ad absurdum of a lot of the seeds that were planted by Reagan. So I do think that this arc goes back very, very far. To my mind, since the question is about shock, because of course we talk about normalization, you have to start with the moment of shock that becomes normalized. Honestly, Trump was a shock and a surprise. And I think at some point we need to come back to Bonnie's idea about, you know, different strata of the culture having different expectations, which affects the degree to which they are or are not shocked. But honestly, the re-election of George Bush, to me, was the most shocking moment in American politics, which I've never gotten over. And again, I think as part of a sort of braid of events that has led us to the current moment. And I say that because that was a moment that I realized that which is undoubtedly naive on my part, that the electorate can be genuinely unconcerned with deeply political issues, can be distracted from deeply political issues. And I'm going to have to paint in very broad strokes here, but you know, the fact that the entire country was riveted for 2 years by Monica Lewinsky and in the 1990s, and yet the fact that George W. Bush could be reelected comfortably after the revelation that the pretext for the Gulf War is a knowing falsehood foisted on the American population, you know, tells you a lot about the currents within the population and the population's willingness to accept as you know, a certain kind of lie just because it's more comfortable, which leads to demagogy and normalization, in my opinion.
Could I, if I take up what I think all of you have suggested, which is to say we need to contextualize the election of Trump in a longer historical frame. We should rather look at it as a sign of continuity or as a symptom of something that was already present. Before we elaborate longer or more on that, I'm curious to ask Fintan, would it be possible for you to also somehow situate the Brexit in such a historical frame and ask the same question? Was the Brexit, was it a disruption or was it a continuity? Was it a sign of a continuity?
So Brexit had a certain kind of continuity. I've been thinking a lot about a figure people may or may not remember called Enoch Powell. And Powell was a really kind of star of the Conservative Party in the 1960s. An extraordinary man, a genuine classical scholar, a brigadier in the British Army during the Second World War, had this very strange kind of camp upper class sort of persona. And Powell in 1968 made a famous speech, right, which said, it's called the Rivers of Blood speech, right? So he said that he could, like the Roman, he could see the Tiber foaming with blood because of immigration, because the blacks, and it is the kind of terms that he used. And I was just rereading that speech because it's very, very interesting in terms of demagogy, which we're talking about, because one of the things that Powell does in that speech is he has this kind of high classical rhetoric, quite literally classical, which for a certain elite. But then he quotes, or whether he's making these up or not, the old woman whom I met in the street who said to me that she can't walk down the street without being surrounded by grinning pickaninnies. The old man, or the young man I met who told me he's emigrating to Australia because within 15 years, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man in England. And so it's this sort of mixture of a sort of very knowing academic, the Tiber foaming with blood, all that stuff, and this sort of street level upfront racism. And Powell's persona was extraterrestrial in some ways, but someone like Nigel Farage took that, and made it, a little bit less confrontational in terms of absolutely open racism, but the anti-immigrant thing, the swamping, all that kind of rhetoric, which, remember, of course, Margaret Thatcher used that very phrase about swamping, we're being swamped, and what Powell did, Powell is arguably from the grave become the most influential figure in contemporary British history. You can't really understand where Britain is without understanding Powell. So what Powell did, he was fired at the time from the shadow cabinet. The Tories were not in power at the time. He was fired by Edward Heath, but he became this huge kind of figure. So at the time, the dockers on the East End of London came out on strike, more or less on a protest to support Powell. He drifted out of the Conservative Party, but then he was the person who understood, okay, the racism on its own is not enough. You link it with opposition to the European Union, the common market as it was at the time, campaigned against Britain joining, and then spent the rest of his life campaigning for what was not yet called Brexit. But that fusion that Powell made of the two invasions, which is we're being invaded by our former colonial subjects, the dark-skinned ones. We used to rule over them. Now they're coming to invade us, and they're going to have the whip hand over us. Plus, we're also being more subtly invaded and taken over by Brussels, which is really a kind of front for Germany. So we beat the Germans in the war, and now they're beating us through this more subtle method. So this sort of self-pity, this rhetoric of decline, this apocalyptic rhetoric was already very, very much there with Powell. And it became more respectable. So Powell was a kind of pariah figure, and then he was brought back into the fold. Margaret Thatcher used to, spend time talking to him. He was feted very much in the Tory press. So by the time he died, he lay in state in Westminster Abbey, in 1998, which was a year after Tony Blair's election, when we were all thinking, cool Britannia, all that stuff in Britain is over. And there's this sort of corpse that's radiating, this fusion of a kind of high camp, elitist sort of language, plus this brutal populist demagoguery. and using the idea that we have been taken over by the European Union as the vehicle, really, that's the thing that gives it kind of real substance. The one thing I would say, if you don't mind, is that I think I completely agree with everybody about the continuity, but I think it might also be interesting just for us very briefly to think about what might be new, what's new in Brexit or what's new in Trump. And I don't know whether people would agree with this, but I would suggest two things, right? So one is the far right was never funny before. The deployment of humor with Boris Johnson, for example, and in a funny way with Trump. Trump's jokes are not very good, but there's a kind of comic relationship between Trump and his audiences, his fan base.
Intentional, you mean? Are we talking intentional?
Intentional, yes. A kind of knowing, collusive idea of, well, I'm saying this, but am I really saying it? I called the Mexicans rapists, but well, we all know it's a bit of a joke. It's that sort of occupying this zone between the joke and the old-fashioned kind of demagogic racism. It's opening up that, which I think is a new cultural moment, which is when political correctness came in and you weren't supposed to say, the blacks are terrible and we must exterminate them or whatever. You have to say it in a more ironic form, and that sort of collusive relationship. It's not like what we're used to with the old far right. And the second thing I think might be different, and this is again where Brexit and what's playing out at the moment kind of tells us that, but also Trump's actual presidency told us this, right? Which is they're no good at governing, right? I mean, fascists were serious about the state, right? They were serious about being in power and using power and doing so in a very concentrated, organized, disciplined, horrific way. Whereas again, with both Trump and Johnson and the Brexit thing, it's what I'm kind of increasingly thinking of calling anarcho-authoritarianism. This very strange mixture of authoritarianism, demagoguery, all the sort of right-wing tropes about us and them, the binaries, all the stuff about the enemies of the people, all that, very serious stuff was going on, but actually no real interest in day-to-day governing, actually, getting hold of the machinery of government. And I don't know whether people would agree that those two things are the discontinuities within the wider continuity. And certainly with Brexit, what we're seeing is a sort of Brexit as an anarchic project, a project which is actually going to, if it's going to lead anywhere, is going to lead to the breakup of the state rather than to the sort of reformulation of the state as an authoritarian power center. The most likely outcome of Brexit is the breakup of the United Kingdom itself. And one might say just finally that, of course, that might also be an outcome of Trumpism, Is it leading towards the breakup of the United States, right? So anyway.
Yeah, shall we take up the question of what is familiar, what we do, have we seen before as tropes of fascist or right extreme or right wing rhetorics? I would say what's most familiar is the combination of self-pity and brutality that seems to be part of the mobilization scheme. Maybe we start with Bonnie and then Joseph. What do you consider is familiar and what is new and very distinct about what we're perceiving nowadays?
So I'll continue maybe with one of the themes that Fintan O'Toole just put on the table to answer the question, which is that the sense of victimization is very much connected to the rejection of government. It's the government that has victimized people, but the argument is from the right, by making deals and letting production go offshore and outsourcing jobs. And I say this in this tone of voice just to say it's all familiar, but not to dismiss it, because there's obviously some truth to it. And so this idea that government is not your friend is partly an economic reality for people who've been dispossessed since the 80s, since neoliberalization. And and have sort of lost their traditional points of economic orientation at home. And so there is a sense that they are victims. They certainly have a lot of privilege insofar as we're talking about the white working class compared to other members of the society, but nonetheless, there is a sense that things have taken a downward turn for them, and they rise to a narration of their situation in which some sense can be made out of it by blaming figures, improbable figures like George Soros or Steve Jobs or the Democrats for creating a situation of dispossession for them. So Trump is very much a figure of aggrievement. He has a particular talent at a kind of storytelling. I also agree with Fintan that I personally obviously don't find him very funny, but I recognize really a Borscht Belt lilt of humor in the way that he tells stories. You know, the way that he, especially in the first couple of years, after a while, his aggrievement kind of took over and his humor somewhat diminished. But if you look back at the first couple of years when his aggrievement was very strong, he was very funny in a familiar old Make America Great Again way, like in a Catskill comedy kind of way. At the time, I and a colleague of mine, Joe Litvak, would joke that he was the first Jewish president because his humor had that kind of quality to it. And of course, it's the New York quality. So that also was dangerous, right? Because politics is boring, but infotainment, politics as infotainment will bring people out to free rallies, to hear good stories and all the rest. So there was a momentum that he could latch onto with that humor, and a kind of flirtatiousness that he was very good at, both being a bearer of brutal violence, using, I love to point out that at his rallies, he would use his thumb to say, "Get him out of here," in this big male voice. And then he would say, "But they're coming to get me." And then all of a sudden his pinky would be up there. "I'm going to need your help," and he could do both. I think one of the strengths of his charismatic appeal, such as it is this sort of ambigendered quality, that he is more man than any man, and he can also impersonate a woman. I can't think of another mainstream candidate who can impersonate a woman having sex on stage in a mass audience and not be demasculinized by that. Like, he alone can do that, right? Which is what he did when he was talking about these two FBI agents who were having an affair, and he went around the country for a year telling everybody about their affair and impersonating her in their imagined sex scene, not him. So, and that's, for most male politicians in the US, a very risky line to cross. So those are some of the sort of rhetorical and corporeal strategies that he's able to use that I think create, that are attractive. And one thing we haven't talked about, and I won't say a lot about it now, I don't know if others have anything to say about it, is he came to us through television. He's a real estate agent, he's a mogul or whatever, he's a New York personality, he's a lot of things, but he's also the star of a show that I didn't watch, but a lot of Americans did watch. And so, like a lot of television personalities, he was very familiar to people who felt like they know him because he's in their living room every week from The Apprentice. And that familiarity is also worked wonders for him. I'll just say that. I think, well, maybe I'll stop there. I'd like to come back and talk about some of the historical context for him, but I also want to hear what Joseph Vogel has to say. So I'll come back.
Joseph?
So your question was, what could be interesting in Brexit or new in Brexit and Trump? And I think Trump is intellectually not very interesting. Brexit is much more interesting because Brexit was a model for Trump, and the Brexit campaign was a model for the Trump campaign. And Professor Honig already mentioned that in the United States and in Great Britain, since the 80s, you have a rising amount of losers. Losers of globalization, losers of deindustrializations, losers of liberalization, losers of financial markets, etc. And the Brexit problem, and this is the interesting problem, and this is not probably really new, but I think attractive, is the question, how can you transform the losers of globalization, the losers of capitalism, to voters for even more extreme capitalism and globalization? This was the Brexit problem, transforming the voters who are losers of globalization to voters who vote in favor of globalization.
So against their own interest.
Against their own interest. And let me make two more remarks. First, it was very interesting in the first dynamics of the Leave campaign that a majority of industry and even banking industry in Great Britain was pro-Remain, because European Union was an interesting field of their interests, because they had a common market, etc. And the ECB, European Central Bank, protected their interests. But, and this is very interesting, there was an avant-garde of financial markets, of fintech, as we say, hedge funds, investment funds, derivative traders, all sort of the modern financial dynamics who voted and were the protagonist of the Leave campaign. They financed the Leave campaign, and even the most prominent figures of Leave campaign came out of financial industry. For them, the regulation of European Union was too strong. They wanted less regulations, less taxes, much more financial capital around in the world, because weak national states are very interesting for financial global capital. And then came, and this is my last remark, came the most interesting moment when people like Nigel Farage, Aaron Banks, etc., discovered that we can change the aims, that the picture and the image of globalization is the European Union, that the picture and the image of globalization are the migrants, are people coming from abroad to occupy us. And this was the very interesting transformation when modern financial industry transformed their politics to a politics of racism, politics of xenophobia, and politics of resentment. And this was successful.
If we take that up and ask both Fintan and Bonnie about the rhetorics, about the demagogy of the Leave campaign, because Joseph was just describing how it actually turned people to vote against their own basic social and economic interest. Could you somehow explain how did that work? How was it possible to transform the angst and basically find a different object for the angst?
But before we do that, can I just inject a sort of one further consideration into the question, which is of great interest to me, which is, I think it can be tricky to treat, and this has become such a line about Trump's base in the United States, how did he get people to vote against their own interests, as if the only interests were social and economic. Yeah. There are other, clearly he's appealing to an interest, and I think we need to take that interest seriously, which is the satisfaction of these inchoate, quite often, and ill-defined urges, resentment. That's an interest too. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to treat that as if, because that is why they're voting against the other interests. So I just think that's worth considering.
So in rhetorical terms, One of the fascinating things about Brexit, and I think Josep's analysis is absolutely right in terms of the financial forces that were at play. But one of the fascinating things about it in terms of its voter appeal is that it was simultaneously revolutionary and offering itself as just a gesture. So it occupied this kind of very strange space where it said, this is the biggest thing that you can possibly do as an individual, as a voter. You have no power. It doesn't matter whether you vote for the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, they're all the same, they're all going to do the same stuff. You don't have any power. So here's a big thing you can do, right? It's an amazing moment. It's a one-off thing. You and you alone, your generation alone can do this thing and free Britain from this oppression. And all you've got to do is go to the ballot box, after all. It's pretty easy as revolutions go, right? You don't have to go out in the street and hang the aristocrats. It seems very easy. But also simultaneously, of course, you must remember that a huge part of the appeal of Brexit was it's not really going to change very much. What Boris Johnson said, so Johnson's absolute ease with mendacity was crucial to this, because so what Johnson said with a completely straight face to his voters was, you won't really notice the difference much. You'll still have free movement. We will have, the trade deal will be just, David Davis, who was the first British negotiator, the Brexit secretary, a big kind of Brexit figure, says, this will be the easiest trade deal ever done. It'll just a couple of hours. It's just, because it's, after all, who wouldn't want to keep selling their goods to England? We're a fantastic market. We're wonderful, and so it managed this simultaneous idea that this is a big gesture, and also that it's a cost-free gesture. That actually, you're not really going to suffer any pain whatsoever in all of this. And that sort of rhetorical achievement, I think, was very much, again, to do with Johnson, and again, to do with this sort of performative side of the thing. The far right has always been performative. We don't have to read too much of Walter Benjamin or whatever, but we know that. But again, it's this particular kind of performativity which said, actually, in a way, there are no real world consequences. That Brexit could be itself be almost pure performance. It allows you to give a real kick to your own elites. These smug people in Brussels, but even more so, of course, these smug people in London. David Cameron. And the establishment people, the BBC, the trade unions, all those people, you can give them a real kick, and your foot won't hurt. There won't be a consequence. And this is why the Brexit project is really sort of falling apart politically, because it sort of offered no consequence. Well, first of all, the fact that there are consequences comes as a bit of a shock. We were talking about the shock of Brexit, but the shock of Brexit for a lot of its voters is, there's no truck drivers. The fruit is rotting in the fields because the European Union workers who used to come and pick the fruit aren't coming. The cost of living is going up and up. We're stuck with a huge 4% permanent loss of GDP. That's the shock. The shock for them is that it's not what it's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be, you have a revolution and there are going to be consequences. The shock was, oh God, there are consequences. It wasn't pure performance after all. And so I think that's what leaves us in this very, very interesting kind of situation. And also, it's not funny anymore. That the whole kind of punk aesthetic of Brexit, the punk rock aesthetic of, that sort of thing, great fun, roguishness, male bad boy behavior. You also mentioned Aaron Banks. Banks's book is called Bad Boys of Brexit. You know, I mean, and it is as infantile and as, you know, male stupidity as that. But the problem, the reason why Johnson won't last and why the Brexit project is therefore in deep trouble is that there's a point comes when the voters start saying it's not funny anymore. You know, and there's a tipping point which is very hard to discern, but it's a tipping point when, you know, you stop laughing with the joke and you start feeling I am the joke. They're laughing at me. And that's happened in Britain, and it's happened incredibly suddenly. And the pandemic has a lot to do with this and all that sort of thing. But, you know, if you think about just how quickly that's turned, it's also, I think, very interesting.
Bonnie?
Maybe that means it'll happen here. We'll see. You know, I think it's quite interesting because the argument, if there was an argument in addition to the performances for Brexit, was an argument about being ruled by an alien government elsewhere and preferring to be ruled by a government at home. Whereas the argument for it's not a conservative argument anymore, but for so-called conservatives or on the Republican side, has been an anti-government argument since, you know, at least Reagan, as Daniel also pointed out. And so it's, you know, the rejection of government, the disdain for public things that Trump evidenced from even before he moved into the White House. He called it a dump. I mean, it was all there immediately, you know, when he was asked why he didn't use Camp David as a vacation place. He said, have you seen it? It's disgusting. So, you know, I mean, and these are the things that are provided for the office, and their provision, I would argue, is part of what democratic government does. It creates public things that represent, you know, the shared experiment in governance. And so, which includes elections, as well as, you know, other kinds of mechanisms for its own maintenance and reproduction. And I think, you know, what Trump was able to do was to create this kind of, or to broadcast this kind of disdain for these kinds of things and a preference for private wealth. And in America, of course, we have great possibilities of social mobility. So everyone can dream that one day they'll be that wealthy person without it being, you know, that is what the American dream is that possibility exists for everyone. That antipathy to public things, however, doesn't just come from the wealthy's disdain for taxation and sharing and government. It also comes from an awareness of what government can do when it's working, right? It can build memorials, it can provide community centers, it can send out tests to everyone in the time of a pandemic. There are all these things that governments do. They're distant, they're far away. We don't all live in Washington, D.C. for the national government, but nonetheless, we can feel its impact. It's possible to feel its impact. I think the issue in the US is that that impact has been integrationist for some time. And so when public things like statues to Civil War heroes come down, or when swimming pools are integrated and then the community says, forget it, let's not have a public pool anymore, what you end up with is a kind of weird collaboration of white supremacy, which is not against government as such, it's just against integration, and neoliberalism, which is against the intrusion of government into markets and is in favor of a more minimized government. And, you know, Reagan had both strands in his presidency and in his person. And so does Trump in a more, well, let's say less, you know, you can't call Reagan patrician, but less prettied up way, where the brutality that was mentioned before is much more on display and also part of what's being offered, which is permission to say what you want and do what you feel without having to worry about anyone else. And of course, a democracy that provides public things is one in which we are careful about what we say and how we treat other people, because we're sharing space. We're sharing objects. We're in the park next to each other. We're in a museum near each other. We're on a bus together. And so we're implicated in each other and in each other's behaviors and judgments. And the permission to just act as if we're not with impunity, I think, is one of the things that we get with that kind of anti-government agenda that we've been living with in the US for quite some time.
I want to jump in and pick up on something that you were just saying, Bonnie, which is, and it goes back to a consideration before about what makes this different from historical models. And certainly one thing that Trump demonstrated, I'm going to try to connect two dots here, is his incredible sophistication, actually, with the media, both television and social media, which he has manipulated extremely well, and in which he seems to have really outstripped all of his competition. You know, I remember when he was elected and everyone said, oh, well, of course, now he's going to drop his Twitter account because he's the president and presidents do it. And of course, the Twitter feed became one of his great weapons and a very effective one. So I think that's a difference too. And that leads me to think of, to pick up, Bonnie, on what you were just saying, we have to talk about the internet and social media as and the sense of a perfect storm, that this contempt for public norms of public space, but which includes norms of public discourse, as feeding into and both reflecting what we know to be the case in internet discourse, that Trump, I think, is as much a product of internet culture as all these other factors which contributed to him being able to rise to power. So I do think we need to talk about
I agree.
media, social media.
Maybe we could start. I think it's good we talk about both. I think we need to talk about the role of mainstream media and the idea of neutrality or impartiality, but I think we also need about the structural implications of the platform economies. Maybe let's start with that, with a question to Joseph. Because you just wrote a fantastic book about this called Capital and Resentment. Could you explain a little bit what were the dynamics that you think were triggered, so to speak, by the privatization of the public sphere and somehow the protection of the idea of freedom of speech on the platform economies that then generated more and more resentment?
It's not easy to explain, but there are some empirical facts which can illustrate the dynamics of this internet communication in social networks, etc. So the model, by the way, for the Trump campaign in the internet, this means Instagram, Twitter, but especially Facebook, the model was Brexit. So the Brexit Leave campaign discovered the micro-targeting politics, and you probably remember the scandal about Cambridge Analytica, etc. So this was already a transatlantic strategic, so American investors invested in Cambridge Analytica, and Cambridge Analytica was very important in this campaign, Leave campaign, etc. You have the same, by the way, the same statistics in Germany. 86% of political propagation in Facebook and social media is coming from the AfD. And there is a certain tendency to right-wing policies, right-wing mobilization in the net. But your question was much more broad, and what is important for this structure of mobilization in the internet. And you mentioned one important thing. It's, I would say, a sort of internet exceptionalism, which began in the midst of the 90s. First step, the privatization of the internet, the privatization of public structures, and the prioritization of private enterprises. And this means that digitalization is a synonym of privatization. First step. Second step, a famous paragraph in the so-called Communications Decency Act, United States, 1996, the distinction between publisher on one hand and intermediary on the other hand. And now you have a situation where these platform industries, and especially social media, can publish whatever they want under condition that the content is coming from third parties, and they are not responsible. This means you have
user-generated content.
User-generated content. And until now, it is impossible to bring together responsibility on one hand and public opinion on the other hand. And this is the third step, this is the take-off of a new culture of opinion, and I would say of info-opinion, that you have now the right to say things that you must not legitimize, you must not give any reasons, etc.
Need not.
Need not.
Yeah.
You need not, but you must not. You have the right to utter whatever you want. And these three steps, privatization, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and the take-off of a culture of opinion without responsibility is, I think, the basis structure of this new kind of communication.
Can I ask one more question and then we go to... What's the role of the understanding of freedom of speech in this? I mean, my understanding is that freedom of speech is somehow used as a Trojan horse to destroy what I think we would call deliberative democracy. Yeah. What do you, can you reflect on that?
It's very interesting. You're referring to the First Amendment of the American Constitution, free speech, which was introduced in 1791. This means,
don't look at me, I wouldn't know.
This means in a time where the only danger of free speech was the government itself. Censorship by government. And this First Amendment, and this is very interesting, was used in the 60s and 70s of the last century by liberalism to make an equation between free speech and free investment. Milton Friedman explicitly says the economy of free speech means that the money market must be deregulated. Investment and free speech are the same thing. And you have some steps in American jurisdiction and legislation where this free speech of financial market was realized. It was, the first step was 1968, where the Supreme Court gave privileges to private investors in elections. And the last step was 2010, probably you know it, it was the so-called super PAC legislation, that now you have endless private money to interfere in campaigns, electoral campaigns, and this means, and this was one of the beginning questions of this panel, these elections are not equal democratic elections. These elections in the United States are organized by plutocracy. Sophie.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
No. Carolin, maybe we want to move the conversation in the direction of normalization and the structures and apparatuses of normalization. I think, you know, we began with shock, and I'm sure we could all continue to think of many examples of the kinds of previously unimaginable things that have been happening in our various countries. But I'm interested to hear everybody talk about the mechanics of normalization. And I'll, to start this thread of the conversation, I'll throw out a thought that I just jotted down while I was listening to it all at various times, which is, it seems to me there's a passive and an active element of normalization. the active one obviously comes from these demagogic figures who are very self-consciously using these apparatuses, social media, blah, 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 to shock, deliberately shock, and therefore, as it were, soften the ground for further and more significant infractions on institutions of discourse and political institutions. But I think something that we're all interested in for obvious reasons is something that goes with it, which is a kind of passive normalization on the part of media. And I think we all can think of examples, certainly in America, the rise of Trump through the primary process, the failure, it seems to me at least, of the mainstream media to understand the nature of what he represented. And I would say the ongoing failure of many mainstream media to, as we were saying in our first panel, to call a spade a spade. You know, it's still shocking to me that I grew up with the Watergate investigations, which were the central element of American culture for a year and a half, as long as they went on television, in the newspapers. And the fact that, you know, the ongoing investigation into the January 6th violent insurrection is relegated to the 5th or 6th story in many major newspapers, which to me is very shocking. So I'd be very interested to hear the panelists talking about these mechanics of normalization at this point.
Should I jump in?
Yeah,
do.
Right? Okay, so I'm trying to decide where to start. I want to start by saying that Trump is a master of normalization as well. And that one of the things, you know, he came in, he didn't know anything about government, he didn't understand anything, was the line on him, he liked watching television. But, you know, it turns out he was very busy learning how to master all of the tiny levers and nooks and crannies of government. So even though he was this anti-government guy, there are parts of government that he really loved. And he normalized a presidency in which, you know, you co-opt the guy over here, the Jeffrey Clark in the Justice Department and somebody in Homeland Security. And then they'll do what you want. And, you know, so he was very busy co-opting government, but not on behalf of democracy, but what we should call democracide. It was a murder on Fifth Avenue in front of everybody and nobody's stopping him. And I completely agree with you about that. There was a particular challenge, I think, for journalists who had been worked over by, since at least Reagan, decades of conservative objections to liberal media that had trained them, and journalism schools training them into neutrality as the proper position from which journalism is conducted. And if you get a quote from one side, you have to get a quote from the other side, and everything has to be evenly reported or else your bias might show. And I think one of the things that some have begun to learn, and not many yet are fully practicing, is the idea that the job of journalism in a democracy is to represent democracy, even when no one else is. That's the position from which the voice comes. And the voice is not biased. It's partial to democracy because it's a democratic institution, journalism is. But of course, it's, you know, owned by these oligarchs that we have, who also have a lot of access to the electoral process through their money. And so there are a lot of counter incentives, and there aren't, you know, the BBC isn't what it used to be, but at least you still have it. There's very little of that in the United States.
If I could add,
so I think that,
Bonnie, can I just jump in quickly,
yes,
just to add something to what you were saying, because I absolutely agree with this illusion of neutrality, this illusion of impartiality, that I think is we can see perversion of that in American television, but we see it now, I think, here coming more and more too. I think it's not only that one should ask of journalism to be sort of partial or biased towards democracy, but also towards reality. I think part of the problem of this impartiality idea or you know, misunderstanding is it leads to epistemic relativism.
Yes.
And that is, I mean, I think what you were leading up to was it could lead to sort of ethical, political nihilism, but it also really leads to epistemic relativism. And that's, I think, also, if we're thinking in Hannah Arendtian terms, a subversion of the things we have in common. The things that we have in common is a common reality. If we don't have a reference to that anymore, and if that is being subverted by a misunderstood idea of neutrality, we're really in trouble.
Yes, and so that's really important. Of course, I agree with that. I think that's one of the effects of shock, is to attenuate your relationship to reality as such. And if journalism isn't sort of running interference for you there, then it's complicit in that. But I was thinking this morning as I was preparing for this panel about I think a very important fact that we know to be the case about the Trump organization from before he became president, which is that they kept two sets of books. There was a set of books that was the real story, and then there was a set of books for anyone who inquired, legally or otherwise. And double bookkeeping is not only a crime, it's also a way in which people can get habituated into having two realities going on simultaneously side by side. And I think that's very much what's been happening with the litigation over the 2020 election, which is partly a disruption of reality in the usual shock politics kind of way, but also is being done by someone who's used to saying, find me another 11,000 and put it in that column. That's just, he's been doing that for years with the double books in accounting. And so now it just is part of this perfect storm where it becomes, what's 11,000? Take it from that column and put it in this column, done. And I get what I want. So that's the impact of thinking that government should be run like a business, and in particular that it should be run by that business, that kind of business, which has no business being anywhere near government. I do think I said I would mention this at the beginning, so maybe I'll just say it here. I think the sort of prefiguration of the situation we're in now is the litigation of the year 2000 election, when Gore participated in normalizing what might have been the reversal of the popular election outcome for the sake of normality, for the sake of institutional continuity. He decided at a certain point that it would be more divisive to continue to litigate than to give up, which, to many of us at the time just seemed like he didn't want it enough, meaning he didn't want to represent us all enough the way that he should have done. He should have fought harder, is what we said. But you might remember that the mantra of that protest, there was a protest organized by Roger Stone and others in the Republican Party. They wanted the whole election hung on the outcome of the Florida vote. And Florida, of course, the governor was Bush's brother. So there were all kinds of complications in this situation that people called attention to at the time. But the mantra was stop the count. So the Democrats, Gore, had demanded a recount because it was too close. He wasn't looking, I don't think, for 11,000 votes. I think he was looking for like 600 or something that really could have been there if everything had been counted properly. And under a Republican administration in Florida, he had reason to think that it might not have been. So while the counting was happening and they were going to the Supreme Court, the Republicans, to stop the count, they also staged something known as the Brooks Brothers protest, because the men who were in it were all dressed in nice khakis from that looked like they'd been brought in from the Brooks Brothers. And and their mantra was to stop the count. And now it's only 20 years later, and 20 feels like several worlds away, but 20 years later, the mantra is the count that never stops. We just keep you can't count the votes enough times for the Republicans. And instead of the Brooks Brothers riot, we get January 6th, and they're not well dressed. Apparently Trump was somewhat embarrassed about what his supporters looked like. They look like some kind of, mirror image of a Dionysian revelry or something, in their costumes and cosplay sort of stuff. So there's this double track, right? And there's like these two sets of books, and there's what looks normal and normal enough. And then there's what's become of what was a Brooks Brothers riot is now this assault on the Capitol and people smearing their feces on the walls. And, they're connected. they're connected by a strong anarchic, I completely agree with that phrase that someone put on the table, a kind of anarchic authoritarianism whose interest in government is just in the parts that help you to quell and control, and the rest is for looting and grifting and profiteering. So, you know, we sent this set of practices to other countries for 20 years. And as Hannah Arendt would say, the chickens have come home to roost. And the solution is the reconstruction, as it were, of reality. I completely agree with that, Carolin. And the way to do that is to gather together and tell the story of what's happening in the most accurate and democratizing way. That has to be the solution for an effort that, to me, has earned the name democracy. I don't know if we want to call it fascism, but we definitely can call it democracy. Thanks.
And I just, you know, I've worked most of my life as a professional journalist, so, you know, I've watched a lot of this from the inside too. Just maybe three things that we haven't said. You know, I completely agree with what Bonnie's said, so I won't repeat. But first of all, we cannot leave out the huge, overwhelming importance in all of this of climate change and of the very, very powerful forces who needed to undermine the science and therefore needed to undermine the idea of evidence and fact. Right? And so the assault on science is coterminous in a way with the assault on the mainstream media, you know, all that stuff, and is really at the heart of it. Again, the precedents here, we're talking about the dry runs. You know, the right is very good at doing dry runs, you know, and at learning from campaigns that what worked, what didn't work. And the big dry run here was tobacco, strangely enough, right? So what was, you can't really understand so much of what's gone on since unless you understand the incredible success of the tobacco industry, hugely funded with incredibly smart people. I actually knew one of them. I mean, a really, really nice, brilliant man, you know, who spent all his time, you know, doing propaganda for the tobacco industry. And that was all about undermining science, you know, because the link between smoking and cancer was pretty obvious, you know, so you had to undermine it. You also had to do libertarianism, remember, which is kind of hinting, well, even if it does cause cancer, you know, it's your freedom. You have the right to, you know, to do this. And these interfering busybodies, you know, scientists, experts, you know, they're just trying to stop you doing what you have a right to do. And of course, then that feeds into the climate change denial. The astroturf organizations, you know, the tobacco industry set up these kind of phony grassroots organizations. You know, and this again, you have very much this with all these climate change denying organizations, very, very well funded, often refusing to tell anybody where their funding comes from, but we pretty much know where it comes from. And that's kind of crucial. People may have forgotten, but a really, really important moment, actually, which is almost kind of been obliterated from common memory now, is in the late 90s, the so-called ClimateGate scandal. I don't know if people remember this. And this was the first big use of hacking. So there was a huge organized hack on the University of East Anglia in England, and its climate change center, which is one of the most important in the world for processing data. Massive amounts of internal emails stolen, and then cherry-picked, you know, to show where scientists have disagreements or whatever, it's all fraud. They're making it all up. And this story was covered by the New York Times, by the Guardian, by the Irish Times, by, you know, all the respectable media covered it as, look at these phony scientists. And this was just before the Copenhagen Climate Summit, and had a huge effect on the Copenhagen Climate Summit, which was, you suddenly had Russia and Saudi Arabia going, oh, but look, you know, the science is phony. It's all made up. You know, very, very effective. And so this is the dry run for the raid on the Democratic Party emails, for example, in 2016, and subsequent attempts, you know, to do this. So this kind of very, very, this is the one great failure of journalism, which is it's a great story, right? We are primed as journalists to say, oh, secret emails, fantastic, you know, let's get hold of what they say, and let's look for the juicy bits, and let's look at somebody who's calling somebody else a nasty name or whatever. These are great stories. And we are almost constitutionally unable to resist this, even when we know that it has a purpose, which is to undermine democracy, you know. The second thing I just wanted to mention very briefly is that one of the, somebody mentioned Watergate, you know, and I did an event with Woodward and Bernstein 2 years ago, whatever, you know, and it's, you know, for somebody of my generation, it's like, it's absolutely fantastic. But what's the Woodward and Bernstein, what's that iconic idea of journalism about? It's about revelation. And revelation has gone, right? Again, one of the things I think that the Trumps and the Boris Johnsons and that, well, up to now, anyway, Johnson has managed, right, is it doesn't matter what you reveal, because everybody knows already. You know, you know, when Trump says I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and it wouldn't make any difference.
Yeah.
You know, Pussygate made no difference to Trump. If anything, it probably helped him. You know, so as a journalist, you are psychologically attuned to this notion of how do we bring down Nixon? How do we bring down the government? Like, we reveal the truth, you know? And like Trump would just say, yeah, my burglars broke into those Democratic, whatever, you know, but that was just bungling. It was, you know, whatever, you know, it was just, and Trump's fans would say, well, of course, Democrats are, you know, a pedophile ring. You know, it was an act of patriotism to break into their headquarters. You know, it just doesn't, you know. So our whole idea is there has to be a level of democratic shame. And the shamelessness of these figures actually is incredibly powerful. And we as journalists haven't learned how to counteract that. We don't know what to do when we do the revelations and nothing happens. It doesn't really work anymore. And the final point I think is just kind of worth remembering as well about normalization is that a big part of this process of normalization is, of course, a process of renormalization. You know, for a lot of the voters, people who vote for Trump or the people who vote for Brexit or whatever, it's not so much the normalization of racism and misogyny and homophobia and all those kind of things. It's the renormalization, right? So for older voters, they have experienced a time when it was perfectly fine. And if you were a white man, you know, you had these privileges of being able to say all these things, and you think you should really have that power. And then this media, this political correctness came along and took it away from you. I just happened for no particularly important reason to be looking back on the reporting of Freddie Mercury's death, you know, the Queen singer, and Freddie Mercury died of AIDS. And you wouldn't believe the number of respectable columns in mainstream newspapers saying, well, he deserved it. You know, well, what did he expect? You know, he was queer, you know, he was notoriously behaving badly. You know, and there was a period in which mainstream media wouldn't do that, right? You know, they just, you can't do that now anymore, you know, for very good reasons. But what happens then with the internet is, of course, that there's loads of places you can do it again, you know, and we have to understand that that's experienced by a lot of particularly white men as a great relief. You know, you can call people all these names, you can say the things that were unsayable. But for them, this is not a shock, right? It's not, oh wow, this stuff is unsayable. It's a relief, right? Which is, you know, my entitlement to say this is being restored by Boris Johnson or Donald Trump or Orban or whoever else. And so this sort of normalization may be shocking for some of us, but I think for a lot of those voters, it's experienced as a liberation to say what they always wanted to be able to say anyway.
Can I ask Joseph to comment?
It's very difficult to pick up 2 or 3 points in our discussion, but I wanted to underline at least three points. First, I think it's very important what you said, Fenton, that there is a new normalization of ignorance. And this normalization of ignorance is nothing which fell from heaven. It was financed. It was financed by American industries. This means oil industry, tobacco industry, pharmaceutical industry, etc. And the very interesting point here is to create scientific doubt about facts. So maybe that tobacco causes cancer, but we have some doubt because there is a scientific expertise. This is junk science. Yeah? So the link between industry and junk science is one of the origins of our problem today, first. Second, you asked the question, what is common reality? I would say one of the most interesting and probably also of the most important guarantees for common reality is common law. Is a law, is a legal order, is a democratic legal order which is valuable for all of the members of a society. And we see since decades that we have a privatization of law. We have exceptions of law. We have exceptions of responsibility, as I said before. Mm-hmm. And I would say this privatization of legal orders is a second step of losing common reality. And last point, you mentioned that our problem is epistemological relativism. I wouldn't say this is not correct. Our problem is epistemological absolutism. Because if you talk today with someone who thinks that the earth is flat as a pizza, he has all the evidence for him. And you cannot argue because you have to calculate, you have to extrapolate, etc. No? So I would say common reality is epistemological relativism.
I have one last point I would like to make, and then I hand over to Daniel. And that is, if we talk about normalization and also ask now at the end of this panel discussion, you know, how do we resist? What are the modes or the genre of dissidence? What are the modes or the genre of opposition? I would say that part, I think, of one of the most disturbing consequences of the shell shock is that we are only able to address the most extreme acts, the most extreme expressions, the most extreme, violent acts, and we somehow unintentionally become immune for the very, very small signs of the dismantling of norms or of the subversion of standards of civilization. And I do remember that in Bonnie Honig's book Shell Shocked, there is this example of Donald Trump, I think very, very early in 2017, when giving a speech to police officers. He said, I don't know the exact words, Bonnie, correct me. He said something like, you can take away the hand. And what he meant was when somebody who's being arrested is placed in a car, usually police officers are, of course, supposed to protect their heads when they get into the car. So what Donald Trump actually was saying, he was saying, you can hit their heads against the car. And somehow, when I read this in the book, I was actually shocked about myself because I thought, I forgot this already. There was so much else that instead of taking this example as one of the key examples of losing standards of civilization or of dismantling norms, I've been focusing on all the more, extreme or more disastrous signs. And so I think if we think about modes of dissidence, genres of resistance, I think we should all ask ourselves to go back and return to a description of reality that really describes all these small details of subversion of norms of democratic standards?
I'm just feeling very pessimistic lately, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to end on a upbeat note, but I want to return in concluding to a concept that entered our conversation fairly recently, which I think is absolutely key. And I'm inevitably thinking of research I was doing 20 years ago about the Holocaust. And this was about shamelessness. What these leaders have in common is that they give the electorate permission to be shameless. And that seems to me to be an absolutely crucial element, both of the normalization process, because normalization is a two-way street. It's symbiotic. And it seems to me that we're working against, unfortunately, tremendous odds here, because to come back, I think it was you, Fintan, who was talking about this just now, because shame, and I'll also speak now as a classicist, is a very powerful social tool and a very powerful political tool, as we know. And when the culture itself, I'm just very skeptical of internet civilization, is flooded with shamelessness. People are now so habituated to displays of intimate, personal, shameful kinds of details on an everyday basis. That seems to me to be such a fundamental element of the ability of a character like Trump to flip that switch, because everybody is already more accustomed to this kind of behavior than ever before. So, I thought the point that was just made about how Watergate would unfold now, I think it was you, Bonnie, saying, so you break in, that's what you got to do, but it would not, oh, sorry, was it Fintan? So, but that would be unimaginable in 1972. But it isn't unimaginable too, because you turn on your computer and there's, 15 blogs, about how I did this in high school and got away with it. So I do think as much as I think we can never stop fighting, I think the society in which we are currently living is unfortunately has itself softened the ground for these kinds of behavior. And I do think shame and shamelessness are very important elements in the mix that have allowed these people to triumph. And I thought it'd be very interesting, for example, and this is the final thing that occurred to me about this Boris Johnson partying on the night before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, that I have to think that even 20 years ago, he would have been out in a day. It wouldn't have even been a discussion. And now it's dragging on, so I do think we need to pay attention to this. This is a kind of natural segue to a thought about our conversation tomorrow, which will be about anti-democratic networks within democracies and how they are already these sort of parasites within the body politic, allowing these kinds of behavior. But thank you, everyone, for an extremely stimulating conversation.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you all here in the Schaubühne. Thanks, Josef, Bonnie, Fintan, and Daniel, of course. And we hope to see you tomorrow again. Again here in Germany at 4 o'clock. In New York, 10 a.m. your time. We'll have 2 panels also tomorrow. The first one, as Daniel mentioned, on anti-democratic networks with Heike Kleffner, Antonia von der Behrens, and Daryl Pinckney, and Daniel again, of course. And then the second panel will be a memorial culture with Aleida Assmann, Sharon de Duerto, and Daniel and I. See you tomorrow. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.